On the afternoon of October 27th, 1962, at approximately 4:15 p.m. local time, Captain Valentin Savitsky's hand rested on the authorization to launch a nuclear torpedo. Deep beneath the Atlantic Ocean north of Cuba, inside the Soviet submarine B-59, the temperature had reached 122 degrees Fahrenheit. The crew of 69 men were oxygen-deprived, exhausted, and convinced they were under attack. The submarine's forward torpedo room contained a weapon with the explosive yield of Hiroshima, and in that moment, Savitsky believed World War III had already begun. Before we continue with this nearly catastrophic moment in human history, if you're fascinated by the documented stories of Cold War espionage, intelligence operations, and the real human cost behind these decisions, make sure to subscribe and turn on notifications. We bring you these meticulously researched cases every week, uncovering the truth behind some of history's most consequential secrets. Valentin Grigorievich Savitsky was 42 years old that day, a veteran submariner with 19 years of service in the Soviet Navy. According to later accounts from crew members and declassified records, he was considered one of the Navy's most experienced submarine commanders, with a reputation for discipline and precision. He was married with 2 children who lived in a naval housing complex near the Northern Fleet's headquarters in Severomorsk, a closed military city on the Kola Peninsula. His wife and children had no idea that on this October afternoon, their husband and father was facing a decision that would determine whether the world experienced its first nuclear exchange. The story of B-59 is not simply the story of a submarine crew under extreme duress. It is the story of how systems designed to prevent catastrophic errors can, under the right conditions, become systems that make catastrophic errors nearly inevitable. It is the story of men making decisions based on incomplete information, operating procedures that proved inadequate for the circumstances they encountered, and the thin margin by which civilization avoided nuclear war during the most dangerous period of the Cold War. Submarine B-59 was a Foxtrot-class diesel-electric submarine designated Project 641 in Soviet naval terminology. The vessel was 300 feet long, displaced approximately 2,000 tons when submerged, and carried a crew that normally numbered 78 officers and men, though on this particular mission it carried 69. The submarine had been commissioned in 1961 and represented relatively modern Soviet naval technology. It was armed with 10 torpedo tubes and carried 22 torpedoes. Among these torpedoes, unbeknownst to the American forces that would soon be tracking it, was a single T-5 nuclear torpedo with a 10-kiloton warhead, roughly 2/3 the yield of the bomb dropped on Hiroshima. The presence of nuclear weapons aboard B-59 and 3 other Foxtrot-class submarines deployed to Cuban waters in October 1962 was known only to the highest levels of Soviet military and political leadership. The authorization procedures for using these weapons were ambiguous and would prove dangerously inadequate when the submarines found themselves in crisis situations. The deployment of B-59 and 3 other submarines, B-4, B-36, and B-130, had been ordered as part of Operation Anadir, the Soviet military operation to secretly deploy nuclear missiles to Cuba. The submarine's mission was to establish a permanent submarine base in Cuba and to provide protection for Soviet ships transporting military equipment. The 4 submarines departed from their base at Kola Bay on October 1, 1962, traveling independently but along roughly parallel routes toward Cuba. The journey was expected to take approximately 3 weeks. The submarines would travel on the surface when possible to recharge their batteries and provide fresh air for the crew, and would submerge when necessary to avoid detection or adverse weather. The plan called for the submarines to navigate around the southern tip of Greenland, proceed down the western Atlantic, and approach Cuba from the northeast. What Soviet planners did not adequately account for was that by mid-October 1962, American intelligence agencies had discovered the presence of Soviet nuclear missiles in Cuba through U-2 reconnaissance flights. On October 22, 1962, President John F. Kennedy addressed the American public and announced the discovery of offensive missile sites in Cuba. He declared a naval quarantine, essentially a blockade, though that term was avoided because a blockade would legally constitute an act of war, preventing any ships carrying offensive weapons from reaching Cuba. He also announced that the U.S. military had been placed on a heightened state of alert. The 4 Soviet submarines, already at sea and maintaining radio silence for operational security, were unaware of these developments. They were operating under instructions that had been issued before the crisis became public, with no way to receive updated orders or guidance about the dramatically changed strategic situation they were sailing into. During the first 3 weeks of October, B-59's journey had been difficult but not catastrophic. The submarine had experienced mechanical problems with its cooling system, which made the interior uncomfortably hot even under normal circumstances. The crew had endured the typical hardships of submarine service: cramped conditions, limited fresh water, rationed food, and the psychological strain of extended periods underwater. But they had made steady progress southward. On October 25, 1962, 2 days after President Kennedy's address, B-59 was approaching the quarantine zone the United States had established around Cuba. The submarine was traveling submerged during daylight hours and surfacing at night to recharge batteries and ventilate the interior. The crew still had no knowledge of the quarantine or of the international crisis that had developed. That changed on the morning of October 26th, when B-59's commanders picked up radio transmissions indicating unusual levels of military activity. The transmissions were fragmentary and difficult to interpret, but they suggested that American naval forces were conducting intensive operations in the area. Captain Savitsky ordered the submarine to remain submerged and to proceed cautiously. At approximately 11 a.m. on October 27, 1962, B-59 was detected by U.S. Navy ships that were part of the quarantine force. The American vessels had been searching for Soviet submarines they suspected were in the area. The initial detection came from sonar operators aboard destroyers assigned to Carrier Group 2 of the U.S. Atlantic Fleet, which included the aircraft carrier USS Randolph. The commanding officers of the U.S. naval forces in the area were operating under orders to locate Soviet submarines and force them to surface for identification, the procedures approved by the U.S. Navy and communicated to the quarantine force involved using small practice depth charges, explosives that would detonate at shallow depths and create loud noise intended to signal to a submarine that it had been detected and should surface. These practice depth charges, each containing approximately 4 pounds of TNT, were not intended to damage or sink the submarine, but rather to communicate with it, since radio communication with a submerged submarine was impossible with the technology available in 1962. However, this procedure was fatally flawed. It assumed that Soviet submarines would understand the signaling convention, which they did not. The Soviet Navy had never been informed that American forces would use explosive charges as a communication method. From the Soviet perspective, any explosions near a submarine would naturally be interpreted as an attack. At approximately 11:15 a.m., following detection of B-59, several American destroyers, including the USS Beale, began dropping practice depth charges in a pattern around the estimated position of the submarine. Inside B-59, the effect was catastrophic to morale and judgment. The submarine had been submerged for several days, operating at depths between 150 and 300 feet. The malfunctioning cooling system meant that temperatures inside had risen above 100 degrees Fahrenheit. The carbon dioxide scrubbers were working at maximum capacity, but could not keep up with the exhalations of 69 men in a sealed metal tube. According to later testimony from crew members, some men were beginning to experience symptoms of carbon dioxide poisoning, including headaches, dizziness, and impaired judgment. The explosions, when they began, seemed to confirm the crew's worst fears. Through the submarine's hull, they could hear and feel the concussive force of the detonations. To men who had been underwater for days without reliable information about the world above, who knew they were operating in hostile waters during a period of extreme international tension, who were suffering from heat exhaustion and oxygen deprivation, the explosions could only mean one thing: the Americans were trying to destroy them. Captain Savitsky's response, according to later accounts from surviving crew members, was immediate and forceful. He ordered the submarine to dive deeper to evade the explosions. He also began discussing with his senior officers the possibility that war had already begun and that they were under attack as part of a broader American offensive against Soviet forces. The command structure aboard B-59 included 3 senior officers who would play crucial roles in what followed. Captain Savitsky was the submarine's commanding officer. The political officer, whose role was to ensure ideological compliance and to participate in critical command decisions, was the second-ranking officer. The third senior officer was Vasili Arkhipov, 36 years old, who held the unusual position of Chief of Staff of the Submarine Brigade, essentially the commander of all 4 submarines in the group, but who happened to be aboard B-59 rather than commanding his own vessel. Arkhipov's presence aboard B-59 was the result of command arrangements that had been established before the deployment. As Brigade Chief of Staff, he had authority that was theoretically equivalent to Savitsky's, though the exact command relationships in combat situations were ambiguous in Soviet naval regulations. This ambiguity would prove decisive. As the depth charging continued, the American destroyers dropped approximately a dozen practice charges over the course of about 30 minutes. Conditions inside B-59 deteriorated rapidly. The submarine's batteries were depleting as the vessel maneuvered at depth to evade what the crew believed was an attack. The temperature climbed to 122 degrees Fahrenheit. Men began to collapse from exhaustion and oxygen deprivation. According to testimony given years later by Vadim Orlov, who was a signals intelligence officer aboard B-59 at the time, Captain Savitsky at some point during this period said words to the effect of, "Maybe the war has already started up there while we are doing somersaults here. We're going to blast them now. We will die, but we will sink them all. We will not disgrace our Navy." Savitsky ordered the crew to prepare the nuclear torpedo for launch. The procedures for authorizing the use of nuclear weapons aboard Soviet submarines in 1962 were unclear and contradictory. According to some interpretations, the captain had sole authority if unable to communicate with Moscow. According to others, all 3 senior officers had to agree. What is certain from declassified records and crew testimony is that Captain Savitsky believed he had the authority to launch the nuclear torpedo and that he was prepared to do so. The political officer supported this decision. The question became what Vasili Arkhipov would do. Arkhipov's background differed from Savitsky's in ways that may have influenced his judgment during this crisis. Born in 1926 in a small village in Russia, Arkhipov had joined the Soviet Navy in 1945, near the end of World War II. He had trained as a submarine officer and had risen through the ranks during the intensive expansion of the Soviet submarine fleet in the 1950s. His most significant experience had occurred just 1 year earlier, in July 1961, when he had been the executive officer aboard the nuclear submarine K-19 during a catastrophic reactor accident. K-19 had been on its maiden voyage in the North Atlantic when its reactor cooling system failed, threatening a meltdown that could have caused a nuclear explosion. Arkhipov, as executive officer, had been among those who organized the desperate effort to jury-rig a replacement cooling system, which required crew members to be exposed to lethal levels of radiation. The reactor meltdown was prevented, but 8 crew members died from radiation exposure within days, and many others, including Arkhipov himself, received significant radiation doses that would cause health problems for the rest of their lives. The experience appeared to have given Arkhipov a different perspective on following orders versus making independent judgments in crisis situations. He had seen what happened when systems failed and when circumstances deviated from planned scenarios. He had experienced the consequences of decisions made under extreme pressure with incomplete information. Now, aboard B-59, as Captain Savitsky ordered the nuclear torpedo prepared for launch, and as the political officer supported that decision, Arkhipov disagreed. The exact nature of the argument that followed has been reconstructed from various accounts given by crew members in subsequent years. The conversations took place in Russian and in the midst of an extraordinarily stressful situation, so the specific words are uncertain, but the substance is clear from multiple sources. Arkhipov argued that the explosions did not definitively prove that war had begun, that the submarine had not been damaged, and therefore the explosions might not be intended to destroy them, and that launching a nuclear weapon without confirmation that they were actually under attack and without communication with Moscow would be a catastrophic mistake. Savitsky reportedly argued that they were clearly under attack, that waiting for further confirmation might mean the submarine would be destroyed before they could respond, and that their duty was to defend themselves and to strike back at the enemy that was trying to kill them. The argument continued for what survivors described as feeling like an eternity, but was probably closer to 15 or 20 minutes. During this time, the American destroyers continued to track the submarine and occasionally dropped additional practice depth charges, though with less frequency than the initial barrage. Inside the submarine, the heat was unbearable. Men were collapsing. The battery levels were approaching the point where the submarine would be unable to maneuver and would have no choice but to surface or sink. According to multiple accounts from crew members, at some point during the argument, Arkhipov made the decision to assert his authority as brigade chief of staff and to countermand Savitsky's order to launch the nuclear torpedo. The exact legal and procedural basis for this assertion of authority was unclear even to those present, but in the moment, Arkhipov's seniority in the overall submarine brigade structure and his personal authority appear to have carried the day. Instead of launching the nuclear torpedo, Arkhipov insisted that B-59 should surface, identify itself to the American forces, and attempt to establish communication to determine what was actually happening in the world above. Savitsky, according to later accounts, was furious, but he acquiesced to Arkhipov's decision. At approximately 5 p.m. on October 27, 1962, submarine B-59 began its ascent to the surface. The American destroyers tracking it detected the change in depth and slowed their depth charging. When the submarine broke the surface, crew members opened the hatches and desperately began ventilating the interior with fresh air. The scene that greeted the Soviet submariners when they reached the surface was overwhelming. According to later accounts, they found themselves surrounded by a U.S. Navy carrier battle group that included the aircraft carrier USS Randolph, multiple destroyers, and several anti-submarine warfare aircraft circling overhead. The Americans had devoted substantial resources to tracking B-59 once it was detected. An American destroyer came alongside B-59 and used signal lamps and loudspeakers to communicate. The Soviet crew, most of whom spoke little or no English, struggled to understand what was being said. Eventually, through a combination of signal flags and gestures, the Americans conveyed that they wanted the submarine to identify itself and to state its intentions. Captain Savitsky ordered a message transmitted identifying the vessel as a Soviet submarine on a peaceful transit and requesting permission to proceed. The Americans responded by indicating that the submarine was in waters that were part of a quarantine zone and that it should depart the area immediately. Over the next several hours, B-59 remained on the surface, recharging its batteries and allowing the crew to recover from the ordeal of the extended submersion. American vessels maintained close surveillance, but did not attempt to board the submarine or to force it to proceed to an American port. At approximately 11 p.m., after nearly 6 hours on the surface, B-59 received a communication from the Soviet Northern Fleet Command via long-range radio. The message, decoded by the submarine's communications officer, ordered all Soviet submarines in the Caribbean area to withdraw from the quarantine zone and to return to Soviet waters. The message also indicated that intensive diplomatic negotiations were underway and that submarine commanders should avoid any actions that might escalate tensions. Captain Savitsky ordered B-59 to set a course back toward the Soviet Union. The submarine began its long journey home, traveling mostly on the surface to preserve battery power and to maintain the ability to receive communications. The other 3 Soviet submarines, B-4, B-36, and B-130, had similar encounters with U.S. Navy forces during the same period, though, according to available records, none came as close to using their nuclear weapons as B-59 had. All 4 submarines eventually returned to Soviet waters in early November 1962, after the resolution of the Cuban Missile Crisis through diplomatic negotiations between President Kennedy and Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev. The crew of B-59 arrived back at their base on November 8, 1962. They were exhausted, demoralized, and uncertain what kind of reception they would receive. They had failed to reach Cuba as ordered. They had been detected and forced to surface by American forces. They had endured conditions that had pushed men to the limits of physical and mental endurance. The reception they received from Soviet Naval Command was harsh. According to accounts from crew members, Captain Savitsky was reprimanded for allowing his submarine to be detected and for surfacing rather than continuing to evade American forces. Soviet Naval Command appears to have regarded the incident as a command failure that was best forgotten rather than examined. The details of what had occurred aboard B-59 during those hours beneath the surface were classified and remained secret for decades. Vasili Arkhipov received no special recognition for preventing the nuclear torpedo from being launched. The fact that he had countermanded a launch order was apparently viewed as a breach of command protocol rather than as an act that had potentially prevented nuclear war. For the crew members of B-59, the return to normal life was difficult. Many suffered from health problems related to the extreme conditions they had endured: heat exhaustion, carbon dioxide poisoning, and the psychological trauma of believing they were about to die. Several crew members were hospitalized for weeks after their return. The families of the crew members had known nothing of the danger their husbands and fathers had faced. During the weeks that B-59 had been at sea, the wives and children in the naval housing complex at Severomorsk had gone about their daily routines, aware that their husbands were deployed, but having no idea they had been at the center of the most dangerous crisis of the Cold War. According to interviews conducted decades later with family members, when the crew members returned from the deployment, many seemed different, quieter, more withdrawn, less willing to discuss their work. The families attributed this at the time to the stress of a difficult mission, not understanding that their husbands had come within minutes of launching a nuclear attack that would likely have led to their deaths, the deaths of their families, and the deaths of millions of others. Valentin Savitsky continued to serve in the Soviet Navy for many years after the B-59 incident. He commanded other submarines and eventually rose to the rank of vice admiral. According to those who served with him in later years, he rarely spoke about the events of that October day. When the Cuban Missile Crisis was discussed, he would sometimes acknowledge that he had been there, but would not provide details. Vasili Arkhipov subsequent career was similarly successful in conventional terms. He continued to rise through the ranks of the Soviet submarine service and eventually became a vice admiral. According to accounts from people who knew him, the events aboard B-59 and his earlier experience aboard K-19 left him with a deep skepticism about nuclear weapons and a conviction that the procedures for their use were dangerously flawed. However, he never spoke publicly about these concerns and continued to serve loyally until his retirement. For nearly 30 years, the details of what had occurred aboard B-59 remained classified and largely unknown even within the Soviet military establishment. The submarine crews were prohibited from discussing their experiences. The existence of nuclear torpedoes aboard the submarines was classified. The fact that one of these weapons had nearly been used was known only to a small number of senior officers and officials. The public revelation of the B-59 incident began in the late 1980s and early 1990s as the Cold War ended and as both Soviet and American officials began to acknowledge how close the world had come to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis. In 1991, at a conference in Moscow bringing together Soviet and American officials who had been involved in the crisis, Vadim Orlov, the former signals intelligence officer from B-59, publicly described for the first time what had occurred aboard the submarine. Orlov's account shocked the American officials present, who had not known that the Soviet submarines had carried nuclear torpedoes or that one of the submarine commanders had nearly used such a weapon. Robert McNamara, who had been Secretary of Defense during the Cuban Missile Crisis, stated upon hearing Orlov's account that he had not known nuclear weapons were aboard the submarines and that if B-59 had launched its nuclear torpedo, the United States would almost certainly have responded with nuclear weapons, leading to escalation that could have resulted in full-scale nuclear war. The disclosure prompted intensive research into what had actually happened during those critical days in October 1962. Researchers interviewed former crew members from B-59 and the other submarines. They examined declassified Soviet naval records. They compared Soviet and American accounts of the encounters between the submarines and U.S. Navy forces. A clearer picture emerged of just how close the world had come to catastrophe and of the role that Vasili Arkhipov had played in preventing it. The consequences, if Arkhipov had agreed with Savitsky, are impossible to know with certainty, but analysts and historians who have studied the incident have developed plausible scenarios based on what is known about American and Soviet military procedures and decision-making during the Cuban Missile Crisis. If B-59 had launched its nuclear torpedo at the U.S. Navy ships tracking it, the torpedo would likely have struck and severely damaged or sunk at least one American destroyer. Hundreds of American sailors would have been killed instantly. The other American ships in the area would have detected the nuclear explosion through the flash, the pressure wave, and the radiation signature. The American commanders on scene would have reported to higher command that a Soviet submarine had used a nuclear weapon against U.S. forces. This information would have been transmitted rapidly up the chain of command to the Joint Chiefs of Staff and to President Kennedy. At this point, the scenario branches into multiple possibilities, none of them good. American forces would likely have immediately destroyed B-59 with conventional weapons in retaliation, killing all 69 crew members. Tactical nuclear weapons, of which American forces had several hundred in the region, might have been used against B-59 and potentially against other Soviet submarines believed to be in the area. The more critical question is what would have happened in Washington and Moscow. President Kennedy and his advisors had spent 13 days carefully managing the Cuban Missile Crisis, trying to find a way to resolve it without escalation to nuclear war. Premier Khrushchev and his advisors had been engaged in the same effort, looking for a face-saving way to withdraw the missiles from Cuba without appearing weak. The news that a Soviet submarine had destroyed an American warship with a nuclear weapon would have arrived during this delicate diplomatic process like a bomb. It would have provided fodder for those in both governments who favored military action over negotiation. It would have created immense pressure on both sides to respond forcefully. It would have killed American sailors, creating domestic political pressure for retaliation. The most likely outcome, according to historians who have studied the decision-making dynamics during the crisis, is that the United States would have conducted immediate and substantial military strikes against Soviet forces in the Caribbean, probably including the submarine base being constructed in Cuba and possibly including Soviet ships in the area. The Soviet Union would have faced a choice between accepting this retaliation or responding with its own military action. Once military action and counteraction began, the risk of escalation to nuclear weapons use would have increased dramatically. Both sides had tactical nuclear weapons deployed and ready for use. Both sides had strategic nuclear forces on high alert. Both sides had military commanders who believed that if nuclear war was inevitable, striking first provided significant advantages. Whether this escalation would have proceeded all the way to a full exchange of strategic nuclear weapons is impossible to know. There were many points where either side might have pulled back, where communication might have clarified misunderstandings, where leaders might have chosen restraint over retaliation. But the historical evidence from the Cuban Missile Crisis suggests that once violence began, the pressures toward escalation would have been immense. Estimates of casualties from a U.S.-Soviet nuclear exchange in 1962 varied, but most analyses suggested that immediate deaths would have numbered in the tens of millions, with many millions more dying in subsequent weeks and months from radiation, collapse of medical and food distribution systems, and other effects. The long-term environmental consequences, nuclear winter effects, radioactive contamination, genetic damage, would have affected survivors for generations. All of this was avoided because one Soviet submarine officer, suffering from heat exhaustion and carbon dioxide poisoning, surrounded by other officers who disagreed with him, argued successfully that they should not launch a nuclear weapon based on incomplete information. Arkhipov himself did not live to see widespread recognition of his role. He died in 1998 at the age of 72, from kidney cancer that medical experts believed was likely a consequence of his radiation exposure during the K-19 reactor accident in 1961. At the time of his death, his role in the B-59 incident was still not widely known outside of specialized academic and military circles. It was only in the early 2000s, as more documents were declassified and as more participants in the Cuban Missile Crisis gave interviews and wrote memoirs, that Archipov's crucial decision received broader recognition. Journalists and historians began to identify him as the man who saved the world and to argue that his refusal to authorize the nuclear torpedo launch represented one of the most important moments in human history. This recognition, while justified in terms of the consequences that were avoided, oversimplifies a situation that was far more complex than a simple story of one hero preventing disaster. The near use of the nuclear torpedo aboard B-59 was not the result of one person's recklessness or one person's wisdom. It was the result of a system, or rather multiple intersecting systems, that created conditions in which catastrophic decisions became almost inevitable. The Soviet command system had deployed submarines with nuclear weapons but had failed to establish clear authorization procedures for their use. The ambiguity about whether the submarine captain alone could authorize use or whether agreement from all senior officers was required created a situation where everything depended on the personalities and judgment of individual officers rather than on clear rules and procedures. The communication systems available in 1962 meant that submarines operating far from their bases could not receive updated orders or information about rapidly changing strategic situations. B-59's crew was operating on orders issued before the Cuban Missile Crisis became public, with no way to know how the crisis was developing or what their government wanted them to do. The American command system had approved the use of practice depth charges to signal submarines to surface, but had not considered that Soviet submarines might not understand this signaling convention and might interpret the explosions as attacks. This failure of imagination, the assumption that the enemy would interpret signals the way you intended them rather than the way they experienced them, created a classic communication failure in a crisis situation. The technical limitations of diesel-electric submarines meant that crews endured extreme physical hardships during extended operations, including heat, poor air quality, and exhaustion that impaired judgment precisely when clear thinking was most needed. All of these systemic factors converged aboard B-59 on October 27, 1962, creating a situation where the decision about whether to launch a nuclear weapon came down to an argument between three officers who were exhausted, oxygen-deprived, operating on incomplete information, and facing what they genuinely believed might be imminent death. In that context, both Savitsky's decision to prepare to launch the nuclear torpedo and Arkhipov's decision to refuse authorization can be understood as reasonable responses to an impossible situation. Savitsky believed his submarine was under attack, believed war might have already started, believed his duty was to defend his vessel and strike back at the enemy. These were not unreasonable conclusions given the information available to him and the circumstances he faced. Arkhipov's decision to refuse authorization was based on uncertainty, on the recognition that they did not actually know whether war had started, that the explosions had not damaged the submarine, that using a nuclear weapon without certainty would be irreversible and catastrophic. His wisdom lay not in special knowledge, but in his willingness to acknowledge what he did not know and to insist on caution in the face of that uncertainty. The broader implications of the B-59 incident for nuclear weapons policy and military procedures were significant, though they developed slowly and were often not directly attributed to the incident since it remained classified for so long. Within the Soviet Navy, the ambiguous authorization procedures for nuclear weapons used aboard submarines were eventually clarified and tightened. By the late 1960s, explicit rules had been established requiring communication with higher command before any nuclear weapon could be used, except in cases where the submarine was under direct attack and communication was impossible. Within the U.S. Navy, the practice of using practice depth charges to signal submarines to surface was eventually discontinued, partly because of recognition that it could be misinterpreted. Alternative communication methods were developed, including underwater telephone systems and internationally recognized signal protocols. More broadly, the Cuban Missile Crisis as a whole, and gradually, as the details of incidents like B-59 became known, those specific close calls led to recognition by both American and Soviet leadership that the risk of accidental or unintended nuclear war was unacceptably high. This recognition contributed to the establishment of the Washington-Moscow Hotline in 1963, to various arms control agreements in subsequent years, and to gradual improvements in communication and procedures designed to reduce the risk of miscalculation. But these systemic improvements took years or decades to implement, and many of the same fundamental problems remained throughout the Cold War and persist today. Nuclear weapons systems still depend on human judgment in crisis situations. Communication between adversaries during crises remains difficult and subject to misinterpretation. The pressure to respond quickly to perceived attacks creates conditions where mistakes can have catastrophic consequences. The men who served aboard B-59 during its October 1962 deployment lived with their memories of those days for the rest of their lives. Interviews conducted with crew members in the 1990s and 2000s revealed that many had suffered long-term psychological effects from the experience. Several described nightmares, anxiety, and difficulty trusting authority figures who might again put them in impossible situations. Vadim Orlov, the signals intelligence officer who first publicly revealed the details of what had occurred aboard B-59, spent years after his retirement from the Navy speaking to students, journalists, and researchers about his experiences. He emphasized in these talks that the near disaster aboard B-59 was not the result of anyone's malice or incompetence, but rather the result of systemic failures, poor communication, inadequate procedures, and the inherent dangers of nuclear weapons. In one of his last interviews, conducted in 2006, Orlov was asked whether he believed nuclear war was still possible in the modern world. He answered that as long as nuclear weapons existed, and as long as human beings were making decisions about their use under conditions of incomplete information and intense pressure, catastrophic mistakes remained possible. He expressed hope that the world had learned from the close calls of the Cold War, but he did not express confidence that similar incidents could not occur again. Orlov died in 2007. The question of how to remember and honor Vasili Arkhipov has been debated among historians and activists concerned with nuclear weapons. Some have argued that he should be recognized as one of the most important figures in human history, a man whose single decision prevented nuclear war. Others have argued that this focus on individual heroism misses the larger point about systemic failures and the continuing dangers of nuclear weapons. In 2002, on the 40th anniversary of the Cuban Missile Crisis, the Future of Life Institute gave Arkhipov a posthumous award recognizing his role in preventing nuclear war. According to reports, his widow accepted the award on his behalf and noted in her remarks that her husband would have been uncomfortable with being singled out for recognition, as he had viewed his actions as simply doing his duty according to his judgment of the situation. There is no large memorial to Arkhipov in Russia or elsewhere. According to accounts from visitors, his grave in a cemetery near Moscow is marked with a simple stone listing his name, dates of birth and death, and rank. Visitors occasionally leave flowers, particularly on significant anniversaries of the Cuban Missile Crisis, but he remains largely unknown to the general public, even in Russia. Valentin Savitsky died in the late 1990s, having served in the Soviet Navy for more than 40 years and having risen to the rank of vice admiral. According to available records, his obituary in Russian naval publications made no mention of the Cuban Missile Crisis or of his service aboard B-59. It listed his years of service, his promotions, and his decorations. The most significant decision of his life, the decision to prepare to launch a nuclear torpedo, and then the decision to accept Arkhipav's refusal to authorize that launch, remained classified information that could not be publicly acknowledged. The families of both men learned the full story only years after the events. According to interviews conducted with family members in the early 2000s, the revelation of how close their husbands and fathers had come to triggering nuclear war brought a strange mixture of emotions: pride in their service, horror at the proximity to catastrophe, and a profound sense of having lived their entire lives not knowing that the world had nearly ended on an October afternoon in 1962. The children who grew up in the naval housing complex at Severomorsk during the Cold War, including the children of B-59 crew members, lived ordinary Soviet childhoods. They attended school, played with friends, celebrated holidays, and grew into adulthood, never knowing that their fathers had faced moments when their decisions would determine whether those children would live to grow up at all. The other crew members of B-59 returned to their families and their lives after the deployment, most of them never speaking publicly about what they had experienced, even after the incident was declassified. They attended reunions occasionally, gatherings of submarine veterans where they could talk with others who understood what submarine service had been like during the Cold War. But even among themselves, discussions of the October 1962 deployment and what had almost happened remained difficult. The recognition that the world had come so close to nuclear war during the Cuban Missile Crisis, and specifically that a Soviet submarine crew had come within moments of launching a nuclear weapon, emerged gradually over several decades as classified information was declassified and as participants in the events grew old enough and secure enough to speak about experiences they had been forbidden to discuss for so long. This recognition has contributed to debates about nuclear weapons policy, military command and control procedures, and the risks of accidental or unintended nuclear war. But it has not led to the elimination of nuclear weapons or to the solution of the fundamental problems that made the B-59 incident possible. Today, decades after the Cold War ended, nuclear weapons remain deployed on submarines operated by several nations. The command and control procedures have been improved in various ways, but submarines still face the fundamental challenge of operating independently for extended periods with limited communication and having to make decisions based on incomplete information. The pressure to respond quickly to perceived attacks remains. The possibility of miscalculation, of misinterpreting signals, of making catastrophic decisions based on partial information persists. The story of B-59 is ultimately a story about the gap between the systems we design and the reality those systems must operate in. The Soviet Naval Command designed procedures for deploying submarines with nuclear weapons, but those procedures proved inadequate when the submarines encountered circumstances that had not been anticipated. The American Naval Command designed procedures for communicating with detected submarines, but those procedures were based on assumptions that proved incorrect. Both sides operated on the assumption that their adversaries would understand their signals and intentions, but that assumption failed under the stress of the crisis. The story is also about the gap between individual human judgment and systemic constraints. Vasili Arkhipov made a decision based on his judgment of an ambiguous situation. That judgment was influenced by his previous experience aboard K-19, by his personality, by his willingness to question authority, and probably by factors even he did not fully understand. In a slightly different scenario, if Arkhipov had not been aboard B-59, if the command structure had been different, if Savitsky's personality had been slightly more forceful or Arkhipov's slightly less, the outcome might have been completely different. This dependence on individual judgment in crisis situations is both reassuring and terrifying. It is reassuring because it means that systems are not completely deterministic, that human judgment and wisdom can prevent catastrophes even when procedures and systems fail. It is terrifying because it means that everything can depend on the character, judgment, and wisdom of individuals who happen to be in critical positions at critical moments, individuals who are making decisions under extreme stress, with incomplete information, and in circumstances they were never adequately prepared for. Vasili Arkhipov was 36 years old when he stood in a steel tube beneath the Atlantic and refused to end the world. He was 72 when he died of radiation-induced cancer, a consequence of his service aboard K-19 one year before B-59. Between those two moments, he lived a quiet life, raised a family, and served his country without seeking recognition. The world he saved barely knew his name. The family he protected never knew the choice he made. And the question of whether such choices will be necessary again, whether we have built systems that can prevent catastrophe, or merely systems that depend on the wisdom of whoever happens to be standing in the right place at the right moment, remains unanswered.